also taking place here in Korea. But I'm excited to see a good turnout from colleagues and to have an excellent panel with me this evening. My name is Nick Taylor. I am the adaptation lead for the Global Green Growth Institute based in our headquarters. And the panel this evening will really be focusing on different types of adaptation approaches based on research and based on practice, primarily based out of some of our East Africa projects. We're also going to be talking about green city approaches in a general sense, coming out of our Uganda office. So not just adaptation, but green from both the adaptation and mitigation angles. And then we're also going to be having a sort of resilience focus with a discussion from a colleague in West Africa who is going to be looking at climate finance issues. So just to kind of kick us off on the topic, I wanted to briefly toot my own horn for 2 seconds. So in 2019, 2020, we published a publication with a UNESCO and UNDP, which was the Future of Asia Pacific Cities report. So it's pretty pretentious, right? When you're saying we're going to really attempt to predict the future. But the 4 areas that we identified as being crucial focus areas for urban resilience at that time. So there was a group of experts and many consultations over a 1-year period that we then put into a report. And they're in the process of developing this. This is for the Asia Pacific, but I think it can speak for many parts of the world. And just to kind of see where we are with these topics. So we said that we needed to scale up nature-based solutions and resilient infrastructure in integrated urban and climate change planning. We said that we needed to understand the informal economy and support urban poor groups to be change agents for implementing city resilience actions. We suggested that we wanted to utilize big data sources to connect communities, cities, and regions, and to improve local government technological literacy. And we said we wanted to create and strengthen partnerships to bring more attention and resources to long-term urban resilience strategies that break silos between national, state, and local actors. Bit of a mouthful, but yeah, so these are just kind of some headline thoughts I wanted to sort of put there on the table for our panelists, for our discussion later, to see where we are as we look to the future of urban resilience discussions and how we work on adaptive and also mitigation approaches. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to my colleague and also very good friend, Julie Greenwalt, who's going to take us through a project that she has been working on. Julie, would you like me to share the slides from my side, or would you want to do it from your end?
Maybe I'll do it from my end, just be easier to switch.
Go for it. I will stop sharing.
Okay. Oops. Okay. I'll put this in. Okay, great. Thank you, Nick. And thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to share. This is my first time actually sharing this publication, so it's a nice opportunity to do that with GGGI colleagues. I haven't timed myself, Nick, so please feel free to be brutal if I'm not progressing fast enough, or definitely give me a warning when I'm at 2 minutes. But yeah, so my name is Julie Greenwalt. I'm an independent consultant working mostly on climate change adaptation with a focus on nature-based solutions and on urban areas. And I work predominantly in Africa and the Middle East, although I'm based out of Brussels. And this was a piece of work that I did last year with UN Habitat, and we kind of wanted to look at nature-based solutions specifically to build climate resilience in informal areas. And we used the term informal areas here because we wanted to try to cover both informal settlements and the informal economy, and sort of areas where there's informal economy. And that goes back to Nick's point, I think, about trying to focus on informal economy, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges with that. So this is kind of a rough outline of the presentation, but also what's covered in the publication. So there's an introduction to nature-based solutions, informality, and climate resilience. And then we go into, in the publication, and I'll talk briefly about research areas and remaining gaps on these 3 topics. And then we look at learning from practice. So we looked at some practical examples from all over the world of how NBS has been applied in cities with informality or in informal areas. And then we closed out with some recommendations and topics for further research and action, recognizing that this was really meant as kind of an entry point into this topic, and we hope that it will spur more engagement. So this is my first time using one of these. I saw this in a workshop recently, but this scan, you should be able to scan this with your phone and it will give you the publication. You may have to click to go to the browser, which is what happened when I did it, but I've also put the URL down there if that's easier for some people. And I can also share a link in the chat as well. So why this focus? I guess I'll say from a very sort of personal point of view, why I was interested in doing this is that I am a big believer in nature-based solutions. I think that they are an opportunity to address the different challenges that we're facing globally and at a local level in terms of biodiversity and climate, and also in terms of sustainable development. But I've always been kind of concerned that the majority of the nature-based solutions applications in cities and a lot of the research has really been focused primarily on Europe and the US, and increasingly sort of coming out of China. But there was relatively less, it seemed to me, information that was coming out about applying nature-based solutions in cities with a lot of informality. And I was concerned, I guess, maybe, or like wanted to check to make sure that this was as applicable and made sense in these contexts. And so that's kind of part of where this paper in collaboration with UN Habitat happened. I'm not going to spend too much time on the scale of challenges. I think we're all well aware of the massive pressing and urgent need to address both the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis, and to do so in a way that's equitable and, builds the resilience and reduces the vulnerability of the most vulnerable populations. And again, this is why I think nature-based solutions has a strong appeal, which is it is a potential for an integrated approach that increases benefits for nature and people. But of course, it really depends on how this is implemented and plays out. So the next slide, just very briefly to go over the research areas and remaining gaps. So the way that we looked at this, so we primarily used the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, and we looked through kind of what they had to say about nature-based solutions and climate resilience in cities and the extent to which that addressed urban informality, and then also looking at urban informality and climate resilience and the extent to which that may or may not address nature-based solutions. And largely, this was kind of in a silo. And this again goes back to, I think, Nick, you brought up the point about breaking silos. And certainly, I think we are interested in this integrated approach. To some extent, it makes sense, right? Sometimes you just have to categorize and classify things. But I think trying to draw some of those lessons learned and linkages between the sort of nature-based solutions or blue-green infrastructure and the urban informality, like there are ways that it overlaps, but sometimes there can be a bit of a blockage in terms of the language used. So, we kind of tried to look at this and what are some of the linkages, and, some things around multiple benefits and some concerns around maladaptation that come up strongly in the NBS discussions, obviously have relevance for urban informality. And some of the discussions around sort of compound vulnerabilities, for example, or pro-poor development could or should be reflected, I would say, in the nature-based solutions dialogues. So so that this diagram is it's updated from the Global Research and Action Agenda on Cities and Climate Change, which was taken up by the Innovate for Cities conference, which was run 2 years ago, I guess, by UN Habitat and GCOM. And, you can see, obviously, both informality and green-blue infrastructure are there, but they're different themes. And again, this was about kind of trying to bring this together. And then we looked at a little bit from learning from practice. So we looked at different examples from UN Habitat, but also from the Innovate for Cities conference, as well as looking more globally. And what we looked at was specifically, what are some different types of nature-based solutions? What are the hazards they address and the benefits that have been documented? But then we did a bit of an analysis on what might be some limits in application of these in informal settlements. So for example, with like, living shorelines, which is something that can be used for coastal flooding. And, it's been shown to have a lot of benefits in terms of preventing coastal erosion. This could be problematic because it does require really significant investment. So, whether this would be applicable in an informal settlement, and, in other cases, there might be situations where it requires a really large area of land that might not be available in urban settings, especially where there's informal settlements on those coastlines. This is an even bigger table. I think no presentation is complete, right, without one very large table that's very difficult to read. Hopefully this is my only one, but this goes into some more detail about other ones, things like tree canopy expansion and green roofs. And again, trying to look at this from the perspective of informal settlements specifically. And for example, with, green roofs and living walls, like this may require additional structural support in situations with informal settlements, or it may be difficult to obtain the right types of construction materials, or it might not be right for high density spaces. So we are just trying to unpack a little bit what some of these, types of nature-based solutions specifically that have been touted as being useful, and what might be some limits in applying them in informal settlements specifically. And then what we did was we looked at both this practice and research, and we kind of tried to pull out some best practices. And so again, this was drawing heavily on some projects that UN Habitat has done, but also some projects that were presented in Innovate for Cities. And maybe not surprisingly, I would say the one that came up the most common was about community involvement. And so like different ways of looking at community participation and engagement. And I think, about this idea certainly about not just seeing people who live in informal settlements or work in the informal economy just as those who are vulnerable, but also seeing the potential for them to be agents of change, and also the work that they've already undertaken that might be useful. But yeah, I would say in general, community involvement is the one where there's sort of the most examples. And then as you get into some of the more difficult issues like knowledge and data and governance, we had sort of less examples, although we all, I think, recognize that those can be really critical and a barrier sometimes to effective action. And then we sort of did two kind of further areas of analysis. So one was what we called interconnected challenges and opportunities. So these are issues that we thought come up both for nature-based solutions and in informal areas, and where there might be some overlap in order to better understand this. So for example, access to services. This is really critically important for people who live in informal settlements. And, a lot of water use, for example, can be done informally, and a lot of nature-based solutions may want to look at sort of integrated water management. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at this also from like a service delivery perspective that benefits both people and nature, and trying to find that balance in informal areas. And then
Julie, just a 2-minute warning.
Oh, excellent. Good. And then, of course, issues around justice and equity, and recognizing, of course, the sort of historical inequities that have resulted in imbalanced spatial patterns that affect not only informal settlements, but also affect like the way that green areas are distributed throughout cities, or access to green areas, or access to water or coastlines. So, I think, again, like unpacking some of these historical inequities that have resulted in the vulnerabilities that we're trying to address, and then also how to ensure that projects that look at nature-based solutions in informal areas take into account this justice and equity. Some stickier ones like land tenure, which is a major issue in informal settlements, but maybe hasn't been dealt with as much with nature-based solutions discussions, and how land tenure may be an obstacle, and ensuring that safeguards related to land tenure are utilized when we're implementing nature-based solutions projects. And then the last slide and the last area was about what we called special considerations for nature-based solutions in informal areas. So this was really, starting to try to unpack what are some things that we think might be particularly sticky, particularly difficult if you're looking at doing nature-based solutions in informal areas. I think the risk of maladaptation, which is something that increasingly is a concern with adaptation projects, but is especially critical in these areas where there are so many vulnerabilities, and the potential for unintended negative consequences would really have a really adverse effect on the population. The one I think that was most interesting to me was about transferability. And so this was really trying to look at whether the guidelines and the tools and the best practices that emerged on nature-based solutions that maybe were mostly out of experiences for US and Europe really have that, are transferable to the local ecosystems, biodiversity, and the urban dynamics that we find in cities, mostly in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and making sure that we don't just say, oh, great, we have this tool on nature-based solutions. It was piloted in all these cities, but not really tackle the fact that those cities have a very different dynamic than the ones where we may want to apply it. And then finally, on the valuation of nature, and this is something that I think is increasingly coming up in some conversations, but how nature is valued both economically, but also socially, and how some of those valuations of natures have been done from a certain perspective, either from a climate perspective or biodiversity benefit, and they may not really take into account the way that people living in informal settlements or working in the informal economy actually value nature for themselves, and and taking that into account in terms of the consultation process, but also the planning for the types of interventions that make sense. That was it. Sorry if I was a little quick, but thank you. And yeah, happy to continue the discussion. And also I will share the link in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. No, that was great. Yeah, there's a lot to get into there, but that's great that colleagues have a direct access to your publication now. So moving swiftly on to our next segment, I'd like to pass over to my colleagues from our Rwanda office. So Liliane Uwanzinga Mupende, who's our NAP project lead, and then Brigitte Nyira Mbugutse, forgive my terrible pronunciation. I believe we colleagues also address her as Dr. B, so that might be easier, who's a senior officer in our Rwanda program. And they're going to take us through some of our most established track record in urban adaptation work in the organization. Super exciting project. So passing straight over to Liliane.
Thank you very much, Nick, for giving us this opportunity to share our experience from Rwanda. I hope you can all hear me quite clearly. Great.
Perfectly.
So great. So yes, I will be making this presentation jointly with Dr. B, as we like to call her. She'll be providing, we'll be giving insight on what we are doing in the secondary cities of Rwanda. But most importantly, I will share what we've done with the secondary cities, and then also introduce what we've done with Huye Secondary City as a case study of one of the secondary cities we've supported in the past, and continue to support. And then my colleague, Dr. B, will then speak about urban forests with a perspective from sub-Saharan Africa. What we've done over the years in Rwanda has kick-started with our support to the government and local authorities, specifically in regard to developing a national roadmap for green growth. And with this, we supported the secondary cities in defining policies and planning that would inform and support them to be able to transition to a green growth pathway. We've accompanied this with capacity building, knowledge management, data collection, and then the last section of our value chain mobilization and support on project implementation. One of the things we've valued mostly across this journey has been the training of trainers, with the intention of creating a paradigm shift in action planning and resource allocation. We supported them initially with the development of their district development strategies, which inform how they would mainstream green growth and climate change into all their initial development plans. We also supported them with revising their city master plans for those that already had city master plans. For those that were planning for the first time, we were able to walk them through the process of their master planning. And during this process, we were able to then integrate green city development projects in what is typically called the capital improvement plans that the secondary cities establish. Under the NAP Readiness Project, we specifically focused on climate resilient city initiatives, focusing on resilience to floods and landslides. And as part of this, we looked at how we could be able to do institutional as well as staff capacity enhancement. Across the board, we support the urban portfolio in different areas, green buildings and construction, sustainable waste management, sustainable mobility, and the most critical element or critical aspect of how we can transition green jobs or create green jobs out of these different thematic areas that we support. If I can start with the case study of what we've done in Huye, we were able to use a very unique approach that we find very valuable in how we engage in Rwanda. We had embedded district senior assistants who supported the capacity development portfolio of our work. And with these district senior assistants, we went beyond just the usual trainings and workshops, but we actually had on-job training and on-job support in the secondary city of Huye. I'm using the secondary city of Huye as an example, but it is critical to note that this cuts across all the secondary cities we were supporting. At the start, these were 6 in total, but the government of Rwanda has transitioned into a different hierarchy of urban areas. So now we have 3 satellite cities and 9 secondary cities. So as I highlighted in the beginning, we did support Huye with the development of their district strategy. We also supported them with the elaboration of their city master plan and the district land use plan that looks at the broader area beyond the urban boundaries. Alongside this, we developed what we call capital improvement plans, and these are used as tools to highlight locally led initiatives or locally led priorities. Therefore, any initiative that the secondary city takes into account for implementation is drawn out of the planning work and then out of this capital improvement plan, which we jointly supported the secondary city to elaborate. As a result of this capital improvement plan and identification of priorities, one of the things we started to do is look at different situation assessments or different projects that can be elaborated for implementation. One of these was the situation assessment and potential intervention areas in waste management, which is informing initiatives at the secondary city in regard to waste management and sustainable circular economy. Specific to our project on response to flood risk, we were able to support them with capacity building across different key areas. Nature-based solutions was one of the critical areas. Land use management, specifically looking at how they could use GIS and remote sensing to enhance their planning, as well as their implementation of their city master plan. We looked at hydraulic and hydrological modeling. And then in addition to this, we had a specific component that focused on proposal development, how to be able to tap into climate finance as a local governance entity, as local authorities, so that they're not significantly or entirely reliant on central government support, but that they can also go out and reach into different financing opportunities to be able to implement their priorities. As a result of this, we have successfully supported several of the secondary cities, but today we share the experience of Huye Secondary City, which has successfully managed to submit a proposal to Intego facility. Intego facility is a facility that has been established under the Rwanda Green Fund, formerly known as FONERWA, which is a facility that is focusing specifically on supporting public sector, central as well as local government. But in this case, our focus was on supporting Huye to be able to implement their flood risk initiatives. Lastly, I'd also like to share what they've been able to do in terms of non-motorized transportation. Non-motorized transportation is very critical because it's one of the ways we are transitioning away from polluting transport alternatives. And we worked with them through this process in terms of planning, implementation, investing, and prioritizing of NMT infrastructure, as you can see in the image I have shared there. And as a result of this, there's been several locally led initiatives tied around walking and cycling and prioritizing the importance of NMT. This has included investment or commitment for investment into car-free zones, green public spaces, a bicycle taxi cooperative, which has employed or created employment for more than 1,000 cyclists, as well as looking at a rental scheme that can then allow for NMT solutions to be advanced as priority transport solutions in Huye Secondary City. Most critical to this, we've seen the fact that the Huye local authority has then prioritized within their own budget allocations, investments in NMT, and specifically in this case, in the car-free zone. I'll close here with sharing a picture of the proposed car-free zone and all the investments that will be jointly driven by the Huye Secondary City Authority in collaboration with the private sector, business owners, in order to be able to enhance a resilient city that promotes walkability, that promotes cycling, and the like. Always important to note that this is centered around the master planning process that we worked together with the Huye Secondary City as one of our key secondary local authority stakeholders. I'll hand over now to Dr. B, who will share about what we have been able to do, what she's been able to do as the lead on this in urban forests from the Sub-Saharan Africa component. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lillian. So I will continue to share with you what GGGI has been able to support with. So this is a publication that has been led by FAO. So we have been invited as GGGI to give our perspective on Sub-Saharan Africa. So if you could go to the next slide. By the way, that is a picture of our view in Kigali, in our office here in Kigali. So we are trying to maintain that urban forest canopy, hopefully. So when you look at this publication, it is a global perspective on the status of urban forests in the different regions of the world. So we have divided this into different regions. I will share with you the link if you would like to learn more, because summarizing 200 pages in 2 slides, it's not that easy. So I will start with showing how it is different between regions, depending on the urbanization. Some areas, they have slow and gradual urbanization, while others, they have sudden and exponential urban. And this is has been driving the differences between these countries when you look at how they approach urban forestry in their cities. So for example, in North America and Europe, they have very much advanced in terms of policies, in terms of financing mechanisms, in terms of the in terms of research, in terms of tools. So for them, they look at urban forest as a social and recreational, bringing social and recreational values if you look at ecosystem services. But then when you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, they use a bottom-up approach because they look at these trees, they look at these ecosystems as giving them spiritual and cultural values. They are attached very much on cultural and spiritual values. So it's not yet there to say that this is a public space owned by the government or managed by the government or any other institution for people to have quality of life, for people to enjoy, for people to have to connect to nature and improve their health. In Near East and North Africa, I have picked very few examples, 2 examples in United Arab Emirates, but also in Jordan, where they have designed an ecological park based basically on so many things, including biodiversity, including soil remediation, including lowering temperature and dust management. So this is something that is very much contextualized within that region. And then in Jordan, they're trying to try the tiny forests that are called Miyawaki, based on the Japanese author of this. So Miyawaki mini forests are the forests that are very small. They call them tiny or mini, and you can put them anywhere in the city where there is an open space, and they bring a lot of biodiversity. They grow fast, and you look at the diversity, but you also look at the tree species. So it has to be intentional on what kind of species you are trying to plant there. Moving on to the next slide, the focus now is on Sub-Saharan Africa. So Sub-Saharan Africa, it has a big range of urban forest policies, a big range of initiatives, needs and financing, but also expertise and driving forces. It's 46 countries, very different in terms of the capacity, financial capacity, GDP per capita. It's very, if you look at Burundi, compare with Gabon, really a difference. So you can imagine also this will also guide the decision that's made by the government or any partner. So there are also a lot of informal settlements. So when you are deciding or designing urban forestry, you also have to look at the design or the urbanization rate. So all of these have put pressure on land, pressure on existing natural ecosystems in the cities. It has also been driven by priorities. How do you choose between this priority and that if you have budget constraints? And so urban forests have been aggregated, leading to the loss of tree canopy, leading to the loss of biodiversity, and attached biodiversity and ecosystem services as well. So when you look at what is more liked or more driving the whole process is provisioning ecosystem services, looking at food, fruit for the schools. So this has been seen in many different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also cultural ecosystem service, the spirituality around the trees. And some countries, some cities, they consider the trees are they worship them. So if you look at, for example, in South Africa, this is very common. There are some trees that are planted just because they speak to people. So it is very amazing how these, so they can't cut that trees because they guide them, they guide their decision, their everyday decisions. So this tree is protected in a sense that it has a value, a particular value to people. So, but also we need to look at the impact that has been, the pressure on land and ecosystems, the impact that has been noticed in different countries. If you remember the Freetown in Sierra Leone, the Freetown flood disaster, it is said that 90% was man-made because the people basically have cut the forests down until the hilly and until also the top of the hills. So basically there was no way that water can be infiltrated in the soil. Like occurred, it had destroyed some of the whole city. So, but now they are rebuilding all over again. So some of the best practices that we have noticed in this part of the world, there have been a lot of partnership between the government and private sector, but also between government and other partners. There have been a big movement of supporting and promoting indigenous species in cities, but also participatory urban planning and development, especially in Kampala and other countries. Next slide, please. So in concluding, we have seen that there has to be a sustainable urban design principles that are conceptual but also cultural relevant, because at the end of the day, who are you building this for? Who are you promoting this for? It has to be the people living in that area, guiding the whole process. So the movement of native species, tree species, this is also in particularity because you have to support resilience to climate change in the near future, but also these tree species are the ones who attract other species. So if you are hoping to increase biodiversity, then you have to use native tree species. And then the next is to see the suitability, the site-specific conditions, and also factoring in that in the near future, the temperature will be increasing, a lot of rainfall. So why are we doing this? Is it for flood mitigation? Is it for landslide mitigation? Is it for fun? So those elements have to be factored in during the design. And then equity. So why do we see this disaggregation between the poorer communities, but also the neighborhood that are somehow new? And so this has been especially in the areas of North America, but you see it even in the new urban areas. So we looked at also the policy. We need to look at the policy reform and stakeholder engagement, because then without the ideas driven by the community and other stakeholders, then you need to consider that as well. Research and climate change consideration, that is obvious, I've talked about it. So we have a declaration if someone needs to look at it, that was adopted during the World Forum on Urban Forest this month, actually, in Washington. So I think I would stop here. I would thank all the co-authors and contributors, but also FAO for engaging GGI to participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. Moving ahead, I'd like to invite Pierre-Joseph Kingbo. So we're moving over to West Africa. We're zooming out away from some of these NBS classic adaptation approaches and looking at microfinance. So we're encompassing adaptation and resilience as part of this discussion before we head over to a more broader green cities discussion. So Pierre-Joseph, over to you.
Thank you. I may not keep the camera on because I have a lower connection. The strength.
No problem.
Diminishing. Okay. The backdrop of how MFIs, microfinance institution, can deal with climate change is the link.
Yeah, Joseph, we can't see your slides. Would you share your screen?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yes.
If you could just put it in presentation mode and then take us away.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay, I will start with this following anecdotal story. In Lagos, a large Nigerian microfinance institution has started screening clients based on geography. If they live in parts of the city prone to flooding, instead of receiving a loan, they are advised to move to another area. Halfway around the world, in California, the largest insurer, State Farm in the United States, has stopped offering property insurance across the entire state due to the increasing risk of wildfires. The two contexts could not be more different, but the phenomenon is the same. Financial inclusion is receding due to climate change. The poor and vulnerable population are disproportionately impacted by climate change because of the high level of exposure and vulnerability to natural hazards. The effects include loss of household assets, disruption of livelihoods, and loss of income, and may lead the poor adopting negative coping strategies regarding education, health, and livelihoods, all of which may impact their long-term well-being. The poor, especially women, are often involved in micro-enterprises, which are often small, informal enterprises and mostly run by household members. They are in various business clusters, including agriculture, livestock, and fishery sectors, which are highly climate sensitive and vulnerable to impacts of climate change. As such, climate risk affect the productivity and income and sustainability of micro enterprises and women SMEs. With climate risk expected to increase with future climate change, it becomes critical that micro enterprises have access to financial and technical resources to implement climate and disaster adaptation actions and build resilience. And this is the backdrop of how MFIs can deal with climate change. And there is a high linkage between climate risk and financial exclusion. Climate change can affect financial inclusion in 3 distinct ways: through physical risk, transition risk, and unintended consequences due to the evolving regulation, financial sector regulation. And my slide is about the climate risks impact. And
Pierre-Joseph, we can't see the slides moving. If you want to move them, please go ahead. But if you want to stay on one side, go ahead.
I would like to stay on this slide to talk about the insurance protection gap.
Perfect. Forgive me. Go ahead.
Yes. I used to work before at the World Bank and at the IMF. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we thought that climate change has no impact on the financial sector. We thought that the insurers would cover the physical risks, and we were wrong. This is why I gave this example of state farms in California refusing to insure any new property. And in Africa, most of the assets owned by the banks and by the private households are not well insured. The coverage of the asset is not adequate compared to the value of the asset covered. And this is what AFD defines as a protection gap. And according to AFD, which is Agence Française de Développement, in Africa, there are about 90% of assets which are not insured at all or which are not adequately insured. And this brings us to the fact that climate change can affect financial inclusion in 3 distinct ways: through the physical risks, through the transition risk, and through the unintended consequences. If you take the physical risk, extreme weather events such as droughts or floods, as well as slow onset ones such as desertification, damage assets and infrastructure, disrupt livelihoods and create costs for recovery. And financial institutions respond to the resulting increased credit risk by reducing the exposure. In other words, they stop financing the most vulnerable segment of borrowers. And these borrowers are generally, for the case of microfinance institutions, the poor households and the small businesses. And that is exacerbating financial exclusion, and it's reducing overall climate resilience of poor households and small businesses. And that happens in rural areas as well as in urban areas for the urban poor. And this is the link with what was said before and what will follow, the presentation which will follow. And if you take the transition risk, they may also drive the financial sector away, maybe for different reasons. The fast pace of green technology advances, in some cases, short-sighted decision-making. And it means that business investments in older technology, like oil and gas, for example, may not pay off, leading to stranded assets. And financial institutions have an incentive to reduce the exposure to those relying on older technologies, like it is the case in Africa, such as non-renewable energy, due to both reputational and liability risks. And the shift away from polluting sector is welcome and vital, but it must be recognized that poor clients have greater difficulty financing the shift to some low carbon technologies. Whether this is the upfront cost of new technology deployed at the business or household level, or as consumers of technology deployed by an energy utility. And a truly just climate transition needs to address poor clients' role as consumers of energy and transport services, not just as workers in high carbon sectors. And without appropriate policy measures in place, the transition could increase inequality and lead to unjust outcomes, such as the more exclusion of the poor. And the third aspect to link climate risk and financial exclusion is the climate-related financial regulations. And those new regulations may have unintended exclusionary effects. For instance, new reporting and disclosure requirements are important for seeing and acting on climate risk exposure, but they are also imposing new costs. If applied without discrimination, such transaction costs will erode the already meager business case for serving low-income clients. And those who are servicing the low-income clients are the microfinance institutions. So the bottom line is simple. Regulation is needed to mitigate the climate risk facing financial institutions, but it should be carefully designed to minimize exclusionary effects. And if it is not the case, climate risk, financial instability, and financial exclusion could cause spiraling vulnerability. This is because clients that suffer reduced access to financial services due to climate risk are left with very few tools to manage repercussions for financial stability. And this is how we need to have MFIs do the right things now. And we need also regulators to do the right things. And I will show you, my presentation will be available, but I will show you a few slides. And this slide, for example, is showing us how the physical risks and the transition risks as impacting the operations and the cash flow, as well as the balance sheets of microfinance institutions. And those physical risks are transition.
Yeah, so just one more minute to go, if you will, if you wouldn't, yes. If you just be able to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, in my conclusion, what I want to say is that microfinance institutions, they need to manage both the physical risks and the transition risks. And right now, the microfinance institutions are either managing just the physical risks, or they are not aware at all of their exposure. And it's like this is a risk which is undervalued by the financial sector, especially in Africa, and especially by the microfinance institutions. So this is what I can say to wrap up. And we need to provide technical assistance, and also we need to provide additional financing to the microfinance institutions to help them take into account the climate risk and to better manage the climate risks without excluding the poor and the most vulnerable people, whether these people are living in rural or urban areas. So this is what I can say as my conclusion. Thank you. I will share the detail of my slide with you, but I try to tie up my presentation with what was said before and what will follow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pierre-Joseph. That was a really interesting zoom out to this macro picture of risk and finance. Thank you very much. So moving on to my colleague, Ron McGill, who's a project lead for our EU Cities project in Uganda. Take your time. I'm willing to bleed into the next hour as we are not having to shift out of the conference room. So over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Bleeding is a trifle painful, and I hope it isn't here. That's item one. Item two, it is always hard to follow such eloquent presentations, but I'll try. And item three, I see we have about 35. I only have 12 slides in order to be within time. Now, am I doing the tracking or it's me? Okay.
I'll track your time. We can see your presentation mode, Ron, which is okay for us, but
I can scroll, huh?
You can scroll, but if you want to click on the three dots there, then you can put it in regular mode, and then we won't be able to. We can see the full view.
You can have regular mode free of charge. Where is regular mode?
You say hide presenter view. Just
don't have.
If you move up.
Oh,
there you go.
Yippee! Right. Okay. Then look. I'm trying to talk briefly about the principles and practice, including a few illustrations of the green urban planning with examples. Every slide in the forefront tends to have more information that I intend to talk about. But in terms of green urban planning, there are 6 areas which are critical. And these areas have been reinforced by a publication which was actually drawn up a few years back by GGI headquarters. Obviously, everything boils down to the use of land. Therefore, good planning is important in order to apportion the land ultimately equitably. In other words, according to people's needs, not being treated equally. Buildings. We already have a track record in trying to explain the meaning of green buildings, which I will go on to in a few minutes. Transport. Everybody is now talking about e-transportation, the encouragement of people to walk around rather than always be in big vehicles. And we always joke here about all the big cars are the people with big, are the big people, which means that they ought to be showing an example rather than just trundling around in their big vehicles. Energy, obviously, green energy in all its forms is important. And this is all part of planning. Water, obviously, the key to everything is water. In the urban scorecard that we have here, and I've developed elsewhere, the most important item, first and foremost, is water. Without it, nothing happens. And then finally here, we have the usual business about waste management in all its forms. I won't even dwell on it. Everybody knows it. Now, this is the Principles 2 Green Urban Impact. This is what we did. This is the source, GGGI Uganda. Land use planning. The ideal is to have, in terms of the middle column, development target. We don't want any. We want zero informal locations, eradication over time. And that isn't about wholesale clearance. It's about gradual upgrading, where, for example, an informal area is in an area that would otherwise be approved in the land use terms, all else being equal, it would be upgraded, not wholesale cleared. As you go into buildings, obviously, buildings that are being approved ought to be in accordance with planning legislation, building codes. In Uganda's case, the rate of approval of the rate of formal approval is under 30%, which is atrocious. Recently, we've been able to get the National Physical Planning Board and the National Building Review Board to create a streamlined approach, making it clear that no building approval is even approvable if the planning approval isn't in place first. Transport, again, anything to reduce petrol consumption. If you've ever been to Kampala, we are flooded with petrol-driven, polluting motorbikes, and yet they are critical to ordinary people's travel mode, traveling from A to B. There is a hidden agenda here because many of the boda are owned by big people who do not want their income reduced by new green initiatives. I won't go on about energy. Obviously, that's critically important, and we want everybody to have uninterrupted access to it, including green energy. Water, obvious. Sanitation, obvious. Waste management, obvious. I really don't have to dwell on these. Now that's Principles 2, Green Urban Impact. Principle 3, infrastructure to tackle poverty. There are two basic models of poverty, lack of income and access to services. Access to services. First is obvious. The second moves, why am I being blocked here with all of this? I'm unable to see my entire, oh look, isn't that clever? I'm being held by a hidden hand, pardon me. The second moves to the concept of multiple deprivation. It can be defined spatially through the recognition of where the services do and do not exist. The Urban Scorecard allows such an analysis to proceed at a city or town level. The Urban Scorecard is at the very first level of thinking about what any Ugandan town should expect as its urban form is being shaped. What does this mean? It means Principle 4, minimal green urban results. Look, having access to clean water. Does everybody have access to clean water? No. Having a functional sewage and garbage disposal system. Does everybody have that? No. Having a home that is weatherproof and secure in tenure? No. Over 60% of urban housing in Uganda is informal, which explains why we have a huge challenge ahead of us. Having constant electricity supplies, do we have that? We have a surplus of energy nationally, but ordinary people don't have access to affordable electricity. Answer that if you will. being able to travel in all weather, obviously that's the ideal. But when we're being flooded, then it's a challenge. And that was interesting comments about nature approaches to flood prevention. And then, of course, the urban core is being able to feel safe day and night. The poverty perspective through multiple deprivation requires that no location, community, or household would ever be deprived of such services. The critical point here is that even getting to this first level of urban results is going to take Uganda many years. Meanwhile, how to get there in Arua and Gulu, practice 1 and 2, we go back to the higher level. This is the completed physical development plan for Arua. It took at least 18 months to prepare. It was community participation driven. It took a long time with much engagement, but frankly, it was worth it. The point is, will anybody pay attention to it? And that's where we're having challenges, because it's like jumping onto a moving train. People are building anyway. People are acquiring their plots anyway. And people are building without approval anyway. In other words, we are dealing with a system of institutional immaturity, and that has to be overtaken, and that will take some time. Equally, we did the PDB for Gulu, same, driven by community participation and engagement. Took a long time, it was worth it. But institutionally, we have a problem, because as I mentioned earlier, under 30% of people actually get their buildings that they're hoping to build formally approved. We have a major institutional immaturity challenge. Let's just move on. Now then, practice of green buildings. The biggest polluter is actually buildings, that orange bit, right? Now, the easiest form of intervention to cure the polluting of buildings is actually the green buildings approach, which is a way forward that we are trying to pursue and pioneer. In our case, it isn't easy, but it's worth doing, and we will do it. Practice 4, green buildings adopted. Now, there isn't any point in talking about green buildings if the institutional framework isn't in place. Excuse me. In our case, the adoption of green buildings is often hindered by the regulatory framework. It does not provide for the use of sustainable, innovative technology.
Just one more minute, Ron, if you will.
As the biggest, I'm with you. As the biggest contributor of large-scale buildings and infrastructure, African governments need to procure green buildings in order to set the trend for other stakeholders in the industry. GGGI has moved to strengthen significantly the country's building codes recommendations now with the Attorney General. Last slide. Oh no, there are 2 examples here, just green buildings, another about green buildings, blah, blah, blah. The last slide, is it possible for you, or is it possible for me to click that first link? Is it?
We can share. We can.
There you go.
We can share the. We can share the slides, Ron, and then people will be able to click. But we're in this mode, we cannot.
Oh, okay. Then anyway, green urban development concepts and praxis, explaining the whole business of the green urban development challenge from the general to the particular. Thank you for your patience and tolerance. I close my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. So we are a little bit over time, but we are not getting pushed out of the room. So I'd love to just take 3 or 4 more minutes just for a concluding word from each of our panelists. Unfortunately, Julie had to head off. She had another call. But I wanted to still ask each panelist for one recommendation for the future of green, inclusive, adaptive cities as we work on them. So a very short answer. Ron, what's your prime recommendation for the future practice of urban adaptation?
Okay. Fascinating information about tiny forests. One, to be used all over, that would be ideal, but more the importance of the cultural relevance of the choice of trees. That, to me, rings a very strong bell, and the person who offered that comment ought to be applauded from on high. We are on the verge of trying to embark upon new green forest plantation projects. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great one. Pierre-Joseph, one recommendation from your side?
Yes, I would like to say that it is very important to see the links between climate risk and financial inclusion. And that should be addressed in the policies and also in the way microfinance institutions are managing the segment of the poor clients that they have. And financial inclusion definitively is important for resilience. This is my last word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brigitte?
Thank you, Nicholas. I think my message would be emphasizing on what Ron had just said on native species, but also the localization of those species in the city, looking at equity, who has access to those resources, but also access to finance. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Liliane?
Thank you very much, Nick. I think I would echo what Ron and Dr. B have just highlighted. It's important to have a focus on locally led initiatives, because then you guarantee stakeholder participation, you guarantee inclusivity, and you also guarantee a sense of ownership and an appreciation of the context and what feeds from or what comes from the context. So locally led initiatives are critical.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, Julie had to head off, but she sent me a little message saying that she would recommend, obviously, I think based on her intervention, a focus on understanding informal settlements better and in making everything that we design relating to land and to tenure as well, that recognizes also the delicate matter of informal settlements as we develop these adaptive and green programs. So we are over time. I will not add any more wise words because everything has been said. So I wish you all a good day, a good evening, a good morning, and thank you all very much for attending. We've had really great attendance and fantastic questions. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And please share the slides, the presentations.
We will.